Hello, and welcome to the Evelyn Y. Davis studios at the National Press Foundation. How long will it be before the car next to you on the freeway has no driver? How long will it be before you buy such a car yourself? Driverless technology is rapidly making advances, and now the government is struggling to regulate it. That's what we're here to talk about today. The National Press Foundation is a nonprofit dedicated to helping journalists cover complex topics with depth and accuracy. We serve journalists in the U.S. and around the world. I'm Chris Adams, Director of Training at the National Press Foundation. The topic today, cars, the kind that drive without you. Known as autonomous or self-driving vehicles, they could be a big part of our transportation future. But before that happens, state and federal officials have to determine how to regulate their existence. And how do the cars work, and what might government oversight of them entail? I'm joined by two experts from the transportation world. Steve Gehring is Vice President for Vehicle Safety and Connected Automation for the Association of Global Automakers. Jack Gillis is Director of Public Affairs at the Consumer Federation of America and author or co-author of dozens of consumer books on cars. We'll be talking about the technology for driverless cars, their safety records, and recent attempts by government to oversee their introduction. We'll also have tips for reporters looking to cover this issue. And we'll take questions from viewers. Tweet them at NatPress or submit via Facebook. Welcome, gentlemen.
Thank you.
Thank you.
So we're going to talk about self-driving or autonomous vehicles and kind of what the potential for them holds. And I think it's fair to say that you're both optimistic about the future of autonomous vehicles, but you're coming at it from slightly different perspectives. So Steve, I was hoping you could tell me a little bit about the global automakers and where in general you stand on the development of self-driving technology.
Sure. Thanks, Chris. Happy to do that. The Association of Global Automakers is an automotive trade association here located in D.C. And we're comprised of major OEMs and some small volume manufacturers as well. And we also have suppliers that are members in our organization as well. Some that are major tier ones, large automotive suppliers, and then some that are new to the automotive industry as well. So that gives us a good cross-section of the industry, and it gives us an ability to work with policy and decision makers on the regulatory and legislative front, and we really seek to have a collaborative approach in engaging decision makers and policy makers here in DC.
Now, give me some definitions here. What's a tier one OEM or tier one auto?
Yeah, a tier one supplier would be a supplier that's dealing directly with an original equipment manufacturer,
okay,
and is supplying directly to them. Okay. So it's they're usually larger automotive suppliers.
Like give me an example.
Oh, you would have like Denso, Delphi, so large suppliers like that are supplying to the auto industry directly. Okay.
And Jack, if you could tell me a little bit about the Consumer Federation of America, what exactly is your organization, and what's your view of the pace and likelihood of AV technology kind of making onto our roadways?
Sure. CFA is one of the nation's largest consumer advocacy organizations. We're made up of over 250 state, local, and national groups. Groups as large as Consumers Union and AARP to small local consumer advocacy organizations made up of maybe one or two people. Our goal is to both educate consumers and represent consumers here in Washington as well as around the country. We are extraordinarily interested in AVs because we see them as a technological vaccine that could really stem a lot of death and injury associated with automobiles. They are one of the products that we are most likely to get injured by in the United States, and death rates have gone up recently. So AV technology has the potential to be a public health cure that we think can possibly take away death and injury associated with motor vehicles.
Okay, and tell me a little bit about your background in analyzing and writing about the auto industry. You have something called the car book that you've been involved with for years?
That's right. Many years ago I was with the Department of Transportation at the National Highway Traffic Safety Administration and helped develop the crash test program, the Uniform Tire Quality Grading System, and a number of other programs associated with NHTSA that are now institutionalized. When I was at NHTSA, we developed this book called the Car Book, which provided consumers with access to crash test data that heretofore was unavailable. When I stayed on for a year under President Reagan's administration, I was appointed under the Carter administration, and the president at that point in time decided to cancel the publication. I resigned, and with the Center for Auto Safety here in Washington have been publishing it for the last 37 years.
Okay, and this is something for consumers.
It's a consumer guide to buying a car, which provides them with access to crash test information, fuel economy ratings, warranty ratings, and just about everything you need to know to make an informed auto purchase, which is difficult for most of us.
Right, and just a couple more definitions here. You've mentioned NHTSA a couple times. NHTSA is a division of the Department of Transportation, right?
Right. NHTSA stands for National Highway Traffic Safety Administration, and it's the part of the Department of Transportation that governs automobile safety.
Okay. So what we're going to talk about today are where legislation and regulations stand on the development of AV technology. We're going to talk about what consumers think of them and how likely consumers are to adopt this technology. But first, I kind of want to talk about what we mean when we actually say self-driving or autonomous vehicles. So, Steve, could you maybe give me a sense of what do those terms mean, and what are the ranges of technologies that we're talking about?
Sure. So I think we're on a journey. As Jack said, this is a real opportunity with automated vehicles to improve safety. We have tens of thousands of people that die on our nation's roads every year. And as Jack said, they've been going up in recent over the last couple of years. So that's really a concern for everyone, I think. And we see AVs as an opportunity to help mitigate those and address those crashes. We have 94% of crashes that occur in our country, in our public roads, that are related to some sort of human behavior, whether it's speeding or impairment or not using a seatbelt. So we really see this as a great opportunity. And as this progression on AV technology, we're starting to see some technologies enter into the marketplace right now, like automatic emergency braking systems, lane departure warning. I think as we move forward here in the years ahead, we're going to see the integration of those technologies to help take over some of the driving task. So some of the early systems that we're seeing out in the market now have the driver in the loop, where it's the vehicle is controlling forward motion. It's also controlling the position in the lane, can react to vehicles and other things around it, but the driver's in the loop. So I think we'll be seeing a progression of folks that are in vehicles and are purchasing vehicles that are assisting them in the driving task. And then we believe that we're on a road to getting to a point where we can see vehicles taking over the driving task from point A to point B. So I think we're at the beginning of a journey here.
Okay, so up on the screen right now we have a video from Tesla, one of the companies that's developing this technology. And this is of an autonomous vehicle making its way through the streets. And we can see what the car's sensors see. Can you maybe just describe, just exactly how does a sensor work? How's that integrated with what the car is doing?
Right, so we're going to see a number of different technologies. What we're seeing here are various views from the cameras that are on board that's recognizing the road around it. It's looking for stop signs. It's looking for various parts of the infrastructure so it can interact safely and assume the driving task here. Here we have the driver monitoring the situation. So we're going to see a combination of cameras, radar, mapping technologies, and fusing this information together at the vehicle to perform the driving task. Now again, we're seeing here where the driver's in a position to take control of the vehicle and is still part of the driving task in a monitoring sense. So I think we're going to be seeing other applications as well where the driver may not have to monitor the driving task, and that will involve additional technology like LiDAR and a greater integration of sensors and very good mapping data as well.
And LiDAR, what is LiDAR?
LiDAR, it's a light-based laser system that helps assess the area around the vehicle and help perform the driving task and identify obstacles and work with the vehicle to make the correct maneuvers.
Okay. Now, Jack, there's actually 5 different levels of automation that the that the DOT and it's a talk about and the industry talks about. Can you maybe just specify a little what that range is all about?
They range from 1 to 5. The 1 is driver assistance, and what that means is it has one of the following. It has automatic braking, lane keeping assist, or adaptive cruise control. It only has one of those items. Next level is 2, partial automation, where it has all 3 of those elements. Again, the driver has to stay in control of the vehicle, and these are things that will help the driver do something better than the driver could do themselves. Then there's conditional automation. That's the 3rd level. Question whether or not that Tesla we just saw was at the 3rd level. Tesla would like to say it's at the 3rd level. We're not so sure. We would have liked to have seen that driver's hands to stay on the wheel. Mm-hmm. And with this 3rd level, you do need hands on the wheel. And yet many of the driving tasks can be taken over by the vehicle. High automation is the 4th level, and therefore the hands do not need to be on the vehicle's steering wheel, but the vehicle cannot drive in every single condition. It may only be able to drive on the highway with hands off, or in certain conditions with hand off. And then the 5th level is fully automation, and that's where you don't touch the vehicle, you do not interact with the vehicle at all. It takes over all of the driving conditions.
Okay, so some of the experiments that are ongoing right now, one of them is in Pittsburgh, where Uber is using self-driving vehicles as an Uber service, and they've been testing that for about a year. Where does that fall on the level of automation? What are they doing there?
Well, that covers the whole gamut, but the big difference is Uber is keeping a driver and a technician in the vehicle during this experimental process, so that if anything goes wrong on Pittsburgh streets, one of the 2 of those folks can take over the vehicle. But it is an effort to try the fully automated version of that vehicle in very challenging conditions. Inner city driving is very challenging for a vehicle such as this. Interestingly enough, Pittsburgh has really become a huge center for testing automotive vehicles, partially because of Uber, partially because of investments by Ford, and Carnegie Mellon University has become one of the centers for the study of autonomous vehicles. There are other areas of the country where these are being tested. They're being tested in Phoenix, parts of California, and the state of Michigan is very proud of the fact that they've developed a huge city, if you will. It's a temporary city, but to test all kinds of driving conditions in a laboratory situation, not out on the real road.
So in Michigan, is this a state development project or a state-funded mock city?
It's funded probably for the most part by the car companies themselves, as well as Google and Apple, and it's come under the auspices of the University of Michigan.
I got it. Okay. So Steve, you also were telling me before about a technology being developed called DSRC V2V. So I'm going to let you explain what that means.
Sure, I'd be happy to do that. So DSRC is dedicated short-range communication, and we believe that is an enabling technology for automated vehicles, for vehicles that are on the road today. And what it is, it's through 5.9 gigahertz, and it's a spectrum that has been allocated by the FCC for automotive safety use. And it's an opportunity and an ability for vehicles to share proximity information. They can actually see each other around corners, so they're communicating with each other with the infrastructure to help improve safety. So we see that as a very good technology that can be that is in use today by some OEMs, and then will also be the connection point for AVs as we move on. So it's an exciting technology, and it really brings the connected vehicle closer to one another and be able to see each other around corners, for instance, and be able to give warnings to drivers to avoid crashes as well.
Okay, so just explain it for a little bit more for me. So if car A's sensors or cameras see something, an oncoming car coming from the side, it could relay that to the cars that are around it.
Exactly. So maybe there's a car a bit in front of you, maybe 2 or 3 vehicles ahead, and if they're in a panic stop situation, that can actually send a message to surrounding vehicles that there's a forward vehicle that is in perhaps a panic stop or a quick stop situation, and will be able to communicate with the other vehicle. The other vehicle could also potentially take action as well to avoid crashes.
Okay. So, so what we're talking about here is these are all methods to help cars become safer. I mean, to use using the AV technology to increase safety. And Jack, you mentioned before the stat that 94% of serious motor vehicle crashes are due to dangerous choices or errors that people make on the road. That's what the US DOT says, I believe.
Yes.
Jack, if you could maybe tell me a little bit about how auto safety has evolved over the decades. I mean, how safe are cars today compared with what they were just a decade or 2 or 4 decades ago, and what might the potential for the safety record be?
Sure. Safety technology has dramatically improved over the years. Those of us who remember the cars of the 50s and the 60s, those vehicles were very rigid. And what that meant was that if they hit something, they transferred most of the energy of that crash back to the occupant. Imagine putting a pencil against the palm of your hand and slamming it against the wall. You want that pencil to collapse. If it doesn't, it's going to injure you. Right. So what we did was we started this crash test program to determine how much of that force is being transferred back to the occupant. And there were big differences in the various vehicles. By publishing those differences, we used the marketplace rather than regulation to bring about safer and better performing vehicles. The next technological change was the introduction of the airbag. Very controversial when it was first introduced. Many of the car companies fought the introduction of airbags tooth and nail. And there's a famous line from then president of Chrysler, Lee Iacocca, who said, "We'll put airbags in my cars over my dead body." Well, he became the first U.S. manufacturer to start putting airbags in what was called the K car. And that began a technology development and a race. First, the only airbags were driver airbags. Today, you have 8 and 10 airbags in a vehicle. And the whole concept is to protect the occupant from that physical force, to stop the transfer of energy from the crash pulse back to the person. And we've made great progress. Now with the automated vehicle, what we want to do is prevent the accident, prevent that from happening, but at the same time maintain that safety shelf for the consumer inside the vehicle, because for an awfully long time there's going to be HDs, human drivers, and AVs into the marketplace, and the two of them are going to be very challenged to work together.
Okay, so the airbags, those came in the 80s?
Yes, they began in the mid-'80s and then started to really multiply in the early 2000s when, in addition to frontal airbags, we had side airbags, knee bolsters, head airbags, rear seat airbags. Right. And so you're coming forward into a cushion of air rather than coming forward into a steering wheel or a hard dashboard.
And this is a very basic question, but are airbags regulated, or are these automakers are making them because the marketplace demands it?
Well, that's an interesting question. When we developed the new car crash test program, what we did was we raised the ante. All cars had to meet the crash test standard at 30, and they did for the most part. Mm-hmm. So we raised the test to 35 miles per hour to see which automakers performed better than what was the minimum level. And we found great differences in those performances. Well, one of the easiest ways for the car makers to improve their performance was to introduce airbags. So it became sort of a self-perpetuating policy, but the bottom line is consumers were concerned about airbags, as many are today about AVs, and yet nary a consumer today would ever buy a vehicle without airbags.
Right.
And
okay.
Chris, I would just
Sure.
add, Jack's given a really good explanation on airbags, and they've really done a tremendous job in helping to protect occupants and drivers. And also belt use continues to be important. It's approximately 50% of our highway fatalities. We still have folks that are unbelted. So really for our restraint systems and our vehicles to work best, we want to make sure that all occupants, front seat and back seat, are wearing seat belts. So we think seatbelts and airbags have done great ways to protect our occupants, and that will still continue with AVs as well. We hope and expect all passengers to always be buckled up.
Is there any good data out there about what percentage of people aren't buckling up?
think there is.
Yeah, well, we're in many states. It varies state by state because some states have laws requiring you to buckle up. Other states have laws in which if you are caught without a safety belt on, it's called secondary enforcement, then you could get ticketed, but you don't have to put it on. The bottom line is we're at the 80 to 90% range, so it's improved dramatically over the time.
Yes, it has.
And those remaining 10%, those are our teenage children probably?
Not necessarily.
Okay.
I think it's across the spectrum.
Yeah.
Yeah. All right. So, we talked about Pittsburgh a bit ago with the experiment with Uber going on there, and we talked about what's going on in Michigan. You also mentioned an AV test in Phoenix. What's going on there?
Well, Google is testing, or now Waymo is testing their cars in Phoenix, and actually consumers can sign up to go in a Chrysler Pacifica and take a test drive around the neighborhood in an autonomous vehicle. We are concerned about the level of testing that may be allowed. We'd like to see a lot more oversight in this testing. We think that some of the legislation that is being proposed on Capitol Hill here in Washington is going to provide the opportunity for manufacturers to put too many of these vehicles into the marketplace prior to them really being tested.
Okay. So Jack, I was hoping you could give me a sense of what's going on from the automakers' perspective. How many of them are developing this technology? Your members or automakers that aren't part of your organization? Are they all doing it or some really gung-ho? Can you maybe give me a sense of the landscape?
I think we're seeing a variety of innovation within the industry. I think we have some companies that are very aggressive and active in the space with starting to develop, and as Jack had mentioned, and test level 4 and 5 vehicles. And I think we're also seeing in the marketplace the lower levels that have the driver in the loop, that are assisting the driver as well. So I think there's great interest in AVs in the U.S., and I think that's a great opportunity for us because that technology can really help address the safety risk that's out on our roadways. So I think we're seeing lots of innovation. The suppliers are very engaged. We have new players that are entering into the transportation space, and we have a great industry here in our country on software. We have those folks that are very interested in it. So I think we're seeing a variety of different work, but I think most of all of the OEMs are engaged and interested in introducing AV technology.
Okay.
I think that one of the things that we have seen to support what Steve is saying, it's not just an interest, it is a rapid fire development. And what's fascinating from the outside is this development is being motivated in part by two industries who heretofore really didn't communicate that much with each other, but the high-tech groups, the Googles, the Apples, the Ubers, are now competing with the traditional automakers. And each is trying to outdo the other in terms of developing this technology. And what both parties are asking for, which is one of our concerns, is the freedom to be able to really go gung-ho and keep this technology coming. And the challenge for safety advocates like myself is how do you create an environment where you continue that rapid development, but you do it with some sort of control, with oversight. The car companies and the technology companies don't necessarily want the oversight right now. They want to be able to develop it. We have an administration here in Washington that's very friendly to that concept. Let's let the marketplace resolve this. And insurance companies, safety advocates are starting to weigh in and say, wait a minute, we need to put the brakes on some of this development and test it and develop standards for it.
Okay, and so we're going to talk about I want to talk about the regulations and the legislation underway right now. First, I want to remind our viewers that if you want to send a question into Jack or Steve, tweet it at NatPress or submit it via Facebook. And if we get questions, we'll work those into the conversation whenever we can. So, Steve, when we were talking ahead of time, you said that compared with other countries, the U.S. is kind of uniquely positioned to lead in this space. Why is that? Is that because of the presence of both the tech companies and the automakers? Or?
Yeah, and Jack touched on it in his comments there, and I think it's a really good point. We have the traditional auto industry that's been producing vehicles in a fairly similar way for a very long time, and they're seeing now an opportunity to really change the consumer experience, improve on safety with new technology. And I think the auto industry is now leveraging, as Jack had mentioned, the Silicon Valley-based companies with that software expertise and that desire to introduce new technology. So I think the coming together of both of those industries with tremendous expertise provides a great opportunity for our country to be a leader in AV technology and to lead in that safety space and provide that safety opportunity in addition to the mobility benefits to the transportation community here in the United States.
So are there any countries out there in which level 4 or 5 cars are on the road or more advanced than they are here?
I'm not aware of other countries that are more advanced. I know that Japan is working on things, Europe is working on things. I'm sure the folks in the auto industry in China is also working on this. So I think it's a bit of a race, but I think the benefit we have here in the United States is, first of all, I think a very good attitude and thoughts on safety with a regulator and a very engaged safety advocate community along with Congress. But I think we're uniquely positioned here to really take a lead in providing this safety technology.
Okay, and so I want to talk about the government's role in this, and
yes.
I'll ask both of you kind of the big picture question. I mean, what is the role of the federal government and state governments in overseeing this technology, and are they working in concert or at loggerheads? And then Jack, I'll ask you kind of the same question in a second. But Steve, if you could give me a sense, big picture, what should the federal and the state governments be doing?
Okay, so I think they need to be making it clear that the federal government and NHTSA, the National Highway Traffic Safety Administration, is responsible for vehicle safety. They're responsible for advocating and making sure that safety technology is being developed and also regulated at some point as well. So I think the role of NHTSA is to be working with the industry, working with safety advocates, working with the transportation community to identify the opportunities of emerging technology and then regulate. The problem is it's hard for the regulator to be regulating ahead of the technology because the technology is being developed, but they need to be assuring safety, whether it's during testing, early deployment. They need to be assuring safety because if we don't get the confidence of the consumer here, the technology is going to be delayed. And as Jack and I said earlier, the delay in this technology, we believe, could really delay safety. And we're having continuing tens of thousands of deaths every year, and they're starting to go back up, as Jack had mentioned. And we see this as an opportunity to address that.
Okay, and Jack, big picture, how well do you think the government, federal government and state governments are doing in overseeing the introduction of the technology?
I'd give them a D.
A D, okay.
A D. First and foremost, the Department of Transportation has issued guidelines for the development of this technology. We as advocates are always concerned about guidelines because they don't have the force of regulation. We believe there needs to be regulatory requirements, tests, testing, standards put in place so as this new technology is rolled out, there is a benchmark by which you can test whether or not it's effective. Let's face it, in the last 3 years, we've had 3 times as many vehicles recalled as have actually been sold and produced. Mechanical problems are happening. They continue to happen. This is amazing new technology. So one could argue that it needs even more oversight than current technologies. So that's one issue. The second issue is, right now, the National Highway Traffic Safety Administration really doesn't have the capability to understand this technology. So we're calling on Congress to give them more money, to even set up a division within NHTSA to govern the autonomous vehicle. The brain power of Steve's companies, as well as the technology companies, far eclipses the ability of the government right now to oversee the development of that technology. So we need help to make sure this technology is being developed. And one thing I agree with Steve 100% is that if we don't be careful and keep accidents from happening with this technology, we're going to turn off already nervous consumers. A lot of consumers aren't too sure about the autonomous vehicle. And the Tesla accident, which got tremendous publicity, really set the whole issue back. We have 4 or 5 more accidents like that as a result of technology that wasn't fully tested, wasn't promoted the right way. Will set back the development of this life-saving technology, and we don't want that to happen.
Okay, so I want to talk about specifically what states and the federal governments are doing, both legislatively and on regs. First, on the state level, I was reading the National Conference on State Legislatures, their website. They're tracking bills moving through state houses. So far in 2017, 33 states have introduced legislation on AV technology, and over the past 5 years, 41 states have done so. A total of 21 have passed some sort of AV-related technology. And the National Conference on State Legislatures, for consumers and for reporters out there who are trying to cover this issue, they actually have a very nice search function on their website where you can go in and look state by state or issue by issue on the pieces of legislation that are being introduced on the state level. So you can go to the National Conference on State Legislatures website, go to the search box, click on privacy and find out all the states that are doing something on privacy and data collection with AV technology. But to kind of help me understand this a little bit more, Jack, could you maybe tell me, what is it the states are doing?
Sure.
And, all these bills, there's, I mentioned, 41 states have considered something. In general, these little tinkers, or are they like trying to authorize these vehicles, or what?
Well, the states are in a difficult position because there is no clear federal regulation, number one, and number two, they have a responsibility to their own constituents. States control most of the local driving laws, registration of vehicles, the condition of vehicles on the road, and as they see these new vehicles coming and being introduced, they're saying, wait a minute, we need some requirements to protect our constituents. And those requirements vary. For example, California attempted to put something through where you must have a steering wheel and brake pedals. Well, that's a huge challenge for some of these manufacturers because they want to be able to develop the vehicle where there is no interaction, because that's a big problem, humans taking over the vehicle when they maybe shouldn't take over the vehicle, or not taking over the vehicle when they should. That's a huge problem that has to be resolved. Other states, for example, have requirements that you do not have to have a driver's license to run in an AV. We're not quite sure why North Carolina passed that requirement,
right,
but it has something to do with possibly people coming in from other parts of the country and being able to test AVs. They also require an adult to be in the car if there is a passenger 12 and under. So each of the states sort of has a different twist. New York passed a law it has a law right now saying you must have one hand on the wheel. Well, they've rescinded that law for the purpose of AVs. So they're confused, and the problem for Steve's group is they don't necessarily want to have to deal with 51 different types of regulations. So that's why we hope to join forces with the car companies, with the technology companies, and come to consensus on rules and regulations and standards that would encourage the development of these great technologies, but also protect the consumers at the same time.
Okay, and Steve, if you could give me the lay of the land on the federal level. So there's both guidance that we've talked about a little bit,
right,
and there's legislation in Congress. Tell me about this guidance that came out of NHTSA and the DOT recently.
Right, so I think it was on September 12th out at M-City in Michigan, where the department rolled out their Vision for Safety 2.0 and kind of framed what they are providing and what guidance they're providing to the auto industry as far as what they should be considering as they deploy AVs, what safety elements they should be taking into consideration. We think that's a really good first step. It's hard to be regulating in a space where the technology is rapidly developing, so we think this is a step that's ahead of regulations that are ultimately here to come. So we think it's a good first step. It's a way for NHTSA to learn and stay engaged with the industry. And I think it also puts the industry on notice that NHTSA is concerned about these items and expects that OEMs are considering various safety items as they roll out AVs. So we think that's a good first step. It's an interim way to move forward and help assure to consumers and to states as well that that NHTSA is looking into this, they're monitoring it, and they're likely to take action here moving forward, which we think is the right thing to do. But again, it's hard to regulate ahead of the technology, and we want to make sure we continue to motivate folks to look at, be technology neutral and look at all sorts of different technologies. So we think it's at least a good first step.
And is this this guidance, is this a continuation of what the Obama administration was doing, or is it taking a turn? Is it a reversal of what the Obama administration's DOT was doing? I think
it's a very similar approach. It's a voluntary submission into to be made public, and I think that was the way it was originally envisioned as well. So I think it's an evolution of how the industry should be interacting with state and local governments, and what NHTSA's expectations are as vehicles are deployed for AVs.
Okay, and Jack, what's your view on this guidance? I mean, why did they do guidance as opposed to regs? Regulations, which would have firmer standards to them, I guess. Would it have been possible for them to do regulations, or would that have taken a lot longer? Is it good to have something on the books as its guidance, or would you have preferred regs?
Definitely prefer regulations. I think some of the aspects of this new technology that Congress is considering approving is, for example, giving the car makers exemptions from current safety standards in the automated vehicles that are being put on the road. We think they should have the same safety standards as all of the other vehicles. We think that there are too many vehicles that are going to be introduced to the marketplace for sale prior to physical standards being developed. The bottom line is there is no question it will be hard to develop standards, and I understand the concept of how do you develop standards when you're not really quite sure of the technology. That's why NHTSA needs to be reinforced with the technical capability to study these devices and make determination on how they should perform. The Insurance Institute for Highway Safety, for example, has been testing a lot of these devices, and they've determined that there are big differences in the lane changing ability of the various vehicles, in their ability to detect something in front of them and stop, the automatic braking. Mm-hmm. And the manufacturers are often using different technologies to implement these changes, and those differences can make a difference if we all think they're the same, but they're not, and they don't all meet a standard. That's dangerous for consumers.
Okay, so that's guidance, from the DOT level. Now, what is Congress trying to do right now? Tell me about the legislation, which has the catchy name, the Safely Ensuring Lives, Future Deployment and Research in Vehicle Evolution Act, or the SelfDrive Act. They're very clever over there. So tell me about the SelfDrive Act. What does it do, and what's your association think about it?
Okay, great. So the SelfDrive Act is something. It's an AV bill that we think is really needed to help develop the safety technology. There's various elements in it. It was a bipartisan vote, and it was approved by voice vote, I believe, on September 6th. So we think the House is certainly House of Representatives has made a stake in the AV area, and it seeks to define clearly federal and state roles. We think it's important that NHTSA is the regulator for vehicle safety design and performance, and we think that that states should have the traditional regulatory, the traditional licensing and registration roles that they have in insurance. So I think the House bill helps define that. And Jack had mentioned a regulatory process called exemptions. We're not talking exempting safety there, but it's a way in this interim period without regulations to be able to put these vehicles out on the road, to understand how they operate, and NHTSA has to approve any exemptions that the industry would petition for.
So are the cars, the Uber cars in Pittsburgh, are those operating under an exemption? Is that something different?
I'm not sure if they're operating under exemption. They could be just considered test vehicles right now, but I'm not sure on that point. But I think on the exemption process, it's something that it's not like a free pass. It's something where we're not exempting safety as an industry. NHTSA, you have to, as an OEM, make the safety case that you're at least equivalent to or better from a safety standpoint of the technology that you are rolling out that is in conflict with regulations that were developed more during a mechanical age.
Okay. And Jack, you and your group, and you and the Consumer Federation of America and other consumer groups wrote a letter to House members when it was being under consideration in the House, saying that the bill, quote, takes an unnecessary and unacceptable hands-off approach to hands-free driving. And you said any setback involving AVs will severely curtail public acceptance of this technology and risk the progress and promise AVs hold to significantly reduce motor vehicle crashes, fatalities, and injuries. I'm sorry. Could you maybe give me a sense? I noticed, your letter had 6 or 7 points. Can you maybe just give me a summary of what your main objections are to the bill as it stands? Sure.
Well, first and foremost, we think there is excessive numbers of vehicles that will be exempted. Right now, we do not think the NHTSA should be allowed to exempt any vehicles from current federal safety standards, number one. Number two, Steve mentioned the fact that there's a tremendous amount of data that's being transferred vehicle to vehicle, vehicle to infrastructure, that's retained in the vehicle. We think that data should be made available to NHTSA with privacy protections built in so that we don't know who is driving those vehicles. But that needs to be made available to NHTSA so that they can step back and take a good hard look at which of these safety features are actually working, which ones work better. So those are the types of things we're concerned about. We're also concerned about the preemption of state laws. We think the states, especially during this time of unknown performance of these vehicles, need to have the ability to step in and put certain criteria themselves to protect their own citizens, especially given that NHTSA has not, the National Highway Traffic Safety Administration, has not really developed a set of procedures. Right now, the Senate is considering a very similar bill. We've sat down and talked with Senator Peters. He's in a difficult position because he really wants to develop this technology because he has a lot of automakers in
He's from Michigan,
Michigan.
Right?
Yeah, he's the senator from Michigan. But I think he also has a sensitivity about not wanting to unleash on the American public something that could go terribly wrong. Again, I go back to the Tesla incident. The National Transportation Safety Board has investigated the Tesla incident, and they were highly critical of Tesla's implementation of that technology. We need that type of oversight with all of the manufacturers. We need standards put in place, and we as consumers need to know the difference between many of these features, which ones really work, which ones don't work.
Okay. And Steve, what do you, the objections that Jack's group has raised, and how do you feel about those objections, and how do you feel particularly about the state preemption? Is that too broad or not, or what do you think?
We think it's again important to clarify the roles and make clear the roles of what the federal government's responsible for vehicle safety and design and the roles of state government. So we think the preemption here is helpful ahead of regulations. So we think that's actually good. We don't want to have various vehicle safety designs based on where it happens to be operating in various parts of the country. So we have one country here, we're able to take vehicles from one state to another, and that's, we would expect obviously that to continue. This helps us in that regard. On the existing regulatory process that we've been talking about on exemptions here, again, we're not exempting safety, and with increasing the number of exemptions, we're going to be able to learn from those vehicles how they, as Jack had mentioned, how they operate in the field, and NHTSA will be able to also get a better line of sight on future regulations as well and what might be required. And it's a platform to get advanced technology vehicles out there. So we think, again, it's actually going to be helpful to safety. NHTSA is exactly involved in that process. We're going to be engaged with the regulator on this. So we're actually, working with Congress, and we're looking actually for regulations here to help the process move forward. So we're not opposed to it, but we have this interim period that we're dealing with, where the regulations here are based for vehicles with pedals and steering wheels. And we're looking to how do we step back from that, put AV technology out there and help improve safety.
Okay, so on the safety measures, I mean, you mentioned before that auto deaths have taken a slight tick up.
Yes.
Is the rate still going down, or is your rate actually going up, or is this just the raw numbers?
So the raw numbers have gone up here about 7 or 8% over the last year or so.
Okay.
We're expecting to get the 2016 numbers from the department soon. We're anxious to see what those numbers are.
Yeah.
So we're seeing the raw numbers go up after, I think, nearly a decade of decline due to belt use and improved vehicle designs. So we're very interested in seeing where that is. I think the rate as average for vehicles mile traveled has slightly ticked up as well.
Okay, and why would that be? I mean, in an era when, I mean, have we hit a plateau in the number of people that are using seatbelts, the number of cars that have airbags, or is something else at work?
Well, I think one of the things is there's been increased driving since fuel costs have gone down.
Okay.
So that has increased the accident rate. But when we look at driver behavior, one of the things that we're seeing increasing exponentially is distracted driving. And with all of the technology that's being built into today's cars, there's a tremendous tendency to be distracted. Whether your cell phone is connected to your car or whether you're eating in your car, there's all kinds of distractions. So the whole issue of distracted driving, we think, is a very serious problem, which has contributed significantly to the increase in fatalities.
Okay, now, I mean, tell me.
And I would say
sure.
belt use is still a concern there as well, in addition to drunk driving crashes as well. We see those increasing here too, and those are typically the tall poles in the tent when you look at fatalities. So in addition to what Jack said on distraction.
I think I saw in your bio you're a board member of MAD, is
Yes,
that right?
I am.
Okay, Mothers Against Drunk Driving.
Yes.
So are drunk driving deaths or accidents, are they going up as well?
Yes, they've been going up, and as Jack had mentioned, as we see an improved economy, we're seeing more vehicle miles traveled, so we're seeing more exposure, and so we're also seeing increases in drunk driving deaths, and there's approximately about 10,000 alcohol-related motor vehicle crashes and fatalities a year.
Okay. So one thing outside of the safety, which we've been talking about, I mean, Steve, I was hoping you could tell me a little bit about some of the other benefits of this technology. I was thinking particularly of the ability of the disabled to have transportation at their disposal. There's a video from Waymo, which is the Google vehicle, showing a test drive where it's showing a blind person getting in the car and being tooled around a neighborhood. I'm not sure if it's a real neighborhood or a test neighborhood. I mean, is that one of the real advantages of having this technology?
In addition to the safety benefits for old drivers and occupants, AVs also have the ability to provide mobility and transportation services for folks that can't drive, that folks, for whatever reason, folks that can't see. So I think it's a real opportunity to provide mobility to sections and segments of our population that aren't well served by our current transportation system. So we really see an opportunity there. And we also see AVs as a platform for greater electrification of our fleet, and that'll have the related environmental benefits. I think we'll see in urban areas where we'll have AVs as part of ride-sharing platforms as well. So I think there's a lot of benefit there for providing transportation services to folks that don't have very good access to that today, while improving safety and the environment as well.
Okay.
I think another benefit is, and Steve mentioned this, is the advent of AVs is really going to decline the need to buy a car. as more and more of these vehicles become automated and cities and areas program the vehicles, you may find that it's much less expensive and far easier to call an AV to bring you to work every day than what I do is drive my car 7 miles, it sits for 12 hours, and I drive it back 7 miles. It really sits unused for 23 hours a day. With the AVs, you will find greater use of the vehicles. Now, that's going to create some problems as well. That means those vehicles are going to have to be very carefully maintained. They have to be designed and built so they don't have recalls, so they don't have major problems, because that'll throw a huge monkey wrench into the system. So I think that that's a great potential benefit. Still, I go back to the need for regulation, and one of the primary reasons is because we are going to go through a very challenging time where we're going to integrate AVs with HDs, humanly driven drivers. And think about all the technology that these guys are developing right now, and all the considerations, what happens when we saw that Tesla video, all the things that were happening, they have to be considered. Also, what has to be considered is the driver inside the humanly driven vehicle. Right. You can't see that driver, you don't know what they're like, you don't know their driving behavior. That's going to be a huge unknown. And you know, one of the examples that the great Raj Rakumar from Carnegie Mellon said, you know, Google was testing its vehicles, they stopped to make a right turn on red. Well, everybody behind them plowed into them because none of us stopped when we are supposed to make that right turn on red. So there are issues like that. Human drivers have huge judgment capabilities. So not only are we trained to drive in these environments, but much of what we do is internalized and somehow just comes out. And how is that going to be incorporated into this autonomous vehicle mix? Again, why we think NHTSA needs to step in, needs to be funded, needs to acquire all the expertise that these guys have and say, okay, which one of these automatic lane changing systems is the best one? And let's have a standard to encourage the best one. And you go down each of the criteria and you say, okay, let's have a standard. We're putting backup cameras in vehicles right now. Extraordinarily important safety device to save young children, and it's turned out to be something people like because it's easier to park. Right. Well, how quickly that camera pops up on the screen has now become very important. And there are big differences in the manufacturers. So should there be a requirement that it must pop up on the screen the minute you put the car in reverse? Okay. That's a question. And we'd like to see those types of regulations put in place for all these other much more sophisticated technologies.
Okay, so in the final few minutes that we have, I want to talk a little bit about public.
I just want to build on what Jack had said there as well. So as we have vehicles, AVs, automated vehicles, operating in an AV mode, there'll be a blending of the fleet as Jack had mentioned. But I also think that one of the additional benefits we're going to get from AVs is we don't expect them to be speeding. We don't expect them to be running through red lights. So I think there's also an opportunity for AVs to be operating in our transportation network in a way that at least the transportation planners would expect. So I think there's lots of unanswered questions.
Teach other drivers how to drive.
Right. So I think it's an opportunity where they may be a calming effect on transportation, but these are questions that are being worked on, and we're going to be learning together on that.
Okay. So finally, I want to talk a little bit about public acceptance of this, because there are, you've both been talking about the benefits to these for safety and mobility. A recent poll from MIT's Age Lab asked respondents what the maximum level of automation they would be comfortable with. A level 5 fully autonomous car polled just 13% support. A car with features that actively help the driver while the driver remains in control was at 59%. And then in response to a slightly different question, 49% said they would never purchase a car that completely drives itself, which means 51% said, under some circumstances they would. Kelley Blue Book had a different poll asking the same kinds of questions, and they basically got to roughly half of people said that they wouldn't buy, or they don't want to have to buy a self-driving vehicle. So Jack, for you, I'm sorry, Steve, for you, does the fact that half the respondents want to buy one, and half don't, is that a good starting point from the industry's perspective? Or if half the people in the country are skittish right now, is that worrisome?
I think, as we've been discussing, consumer education will be key here. It's hard for consumers to imagine when you ask those questions exactly what's being described. And again, I think we're going to be seeing building blocks here. We're seeing it with lane departure warning systems, AEB warnings, so AEB function for automatic emergency braking and lane departure warning. So we're seeing the AV technology at its kind of simplest starting to get integrated into the fleet now, and consumers, I think, like safety technology when they understand it. So I think this will be a transition, and it would be hard for, I think, any of us to say in 2000 or 2003 that we couldn't live, for, just to kind of use a term there, without a smartphone. So I think we're looking at the same thing here as we see the AV technology roll out and consumers are educated. I think they'll embrace it.
Okay, and Jack, do those results surprise you, or what's your response to them?
No, they don't surprise me at all. There's a generational cutoff.
Yeah.
Obviously, AVs are more acceptable to the younger generation than the older generation. The bottom line is, one, we love our cars in America. We think of our cars as an extension of our personalities. We often buy cars that reflect what we think we should look like. And we like to be in control. So this whole concept of giving up control is going to be very, very anxiety producing. And it's going to potentially slow down the development if there are accidents, if there are problems as we move forward in the development of this new technology. We've all had mechanical failures. We've all had our cell phones break down at the wrong time. We've had toasters break down. We've had our cars break down. So the thought of being in one of these vehicles where you really can't control what's going to happen is going to take, as Steve mentioned, a tremendous educational effort, but also it's going to take good experience, and that good experience is going to need to be regulated from our perspective.
Okay, and we've talked about public perceptions of this. We mentioned the Tesla crash. We don't have much time. We just have a couple more minutes, but just very briefly, Jack, what exactly happened in the Tesla accident, and in 30 seconds, what was the kind of the conclusion of it?
Okay, the Tesla accident, really what happened was a white truck went across the road, and the car was not able to see that truck and smashed into it. In the meantime, the driver had completely abdicated control of the vehicle. So the combination of those two things, the failure to observe something that happened, plus the lack of control, which Tesla apparently encouraged, caused that to be an accident. So what we need to do going forward is to have more technology built into the vehicle before, and secondly, educate consumers as to not take their hands off the wheel.
Okay, and Steve, if there's additional episodes like the Tesla accident during this kind of introductory phase, which could be going on for years, several years, is it going to scare off the public, or do you think that they will just, kind of learn to roll with it? There will be accidents every now and then, but they won't deter them from adopting the technology. I
think a consumer understanding, a public understanding of these events are really important to be able to educate the consumers and to really understand the cases of what happened. So I think that's really important here. I think with the NHTSA investigation that resulted and the NTSB investigation that resulted, those are the right things to do. And it's an opportunity for the industry to learn from those things. And again, consumer education is the key here. And that in that scenario, as Jack had mentioned, part of the contributing factors where the consumer the driver was not engaged in the driving test as was expected. So again, consumer education will be very important here. We have a tremendous opportunity, as we both had stated at the beginning of this, of using this technology to help drive down fatalities. So we don't want these events, we want to learn from the events, but we really want to be able to use the technology in a responsible manner to help drive down fatalities. So we got to really kind of focus on the tens of thousands of people that die every year and the opportunity for this technology to help address a good part of that.
Okay, well, I want to thank you both for being here. For our viewers, particularly reporters out there who are covering this topic, we will have links on our website about, to take them to the National Conference of State Legislatures legislation database, to the Consumer Federation, to your organization, to NHTSA, and to DOT's guidance and regs. So I want to thank you very, very much. And I'd like to thank you for joining us today from the Evelyn Y. Davis studios at the National Press Foundation, where we make good journalists better. Today we've heard from two experts about the future of self-driving cars, which are coming very soon to a highway near you. I want to thank Steve Gehring and Jack Gillis for sharing their expertise with us. Find more webinars and reporting resources at nationalpress.org and follow us on Twitter @NatPress.